Thank you. Yeah, now it's working. Thank you for the kind presentation, and thank you, Andrea, for the invitation. You have to know that Andrea and me, we studied in the same place in United States, and in the 90s, late 80s and 90s, and since then we are close friends. That is why I'm here. Thank you, Andrea. You are a friend. Okay, let me show you our experience in donors, egg donation programs. In egg donation programs, we started using agonist GnRH for triggering ovulation. Let me see how it's working. Sorry, let me put the glasses. Okay. Okay, we know since early 70s that we can trigger the ovulation with synthetic lutein releasing factors. This is the work published in 73 for Nakano. And once you see how we provoke the LH surge with GnRH agonist, you see that it's short, is fast, is short, comparing with a natural cycle. But if you compare with SCG, even with agonist of GnRH, we can add a FSH surge that we promote a LH receptor in granulosa cells, and even we promote a nuclear maturation in the oocyte. In conclusion, we can trigger the ovulation using a bolus of agonist of GnRH using antagonist protocol in ovarian stimulation. We know when we're using agonist for triggering the ovulation, this is the Grissom meta-analysis published in 2006. Even we can get more mature oocytes. That could be a benefit if we use agonist for triggering ovulation. And in the Cochrane publication, we saw this meta-analysis that even we have a low birth rate. This is could be a problem. This is the ugly face of the using agonist for triggering ovulation. Even Kolovianakis published that was a higher incidence of early pregnancy loss. And we saw before here when we heard Professor De Broglie talking about ovarian hyperstimulation, how we can avoid the hyperstimulation. And if we see the paper, if we see the paper of Pinar published in 2006, we saw that when we saw individual luteal phase duration in non-pregnant women, we saw that most of them have the period 9 days, 10 days, 11 days. Only one in the study is over 14 days. That means that we make a shorter luteal phase. But my topic is talking about our experience in egg donation using agonist of GnRH for triggering ovulation. We have to know that when we talk about donors, we're working with young women, and women without any infertile factors. And the objective that when we stimulated those donors is to get the greatest number of oocytes and the good embryos, and even to avoid side effects as ovarian hyperstimulation. That is the meaning of when we stimulated donors. This is our experience in the last 3 years. with ovarian stimulation for donors. This is 210, 11, 12, using agonist of GnRH for triggering ovulation, either or ACG. You see in the total numbers, in the blue line, in the blue column, 3,500 cycles with agonist of GnRH or 3,600 cycles of ACG. It was practically the same kind of donors, the same age, and we get 18.6 oocytes when we used agonist of GnRH versus 14.8. That means that was 3.8 more oocytes when we used GnRH agonist. That means more or less 25% more oocytes. And when we study the metaphase 2 oocytes, even we get higher number of mature oocytes when we use it agonist of GnRH. These are our experience in 3,500 cycles. And when we study the pregnancy rate that we get in the recipient when we use it, those oocytes are coming from the group that we use the GnRH agonist or ACG, we saw that the pregnancy rate were completely the same, 61 versus 64, and the implantation rate was 40 versus 40. We're talking about the same clinical results. That is important because from the clinical point of view, we show that at the end, we get the same results, the same success, the same clinical pregnancies. You know that we are working now with egg banking. We vitrify most of them donors, the oocytes, and then we are still having both fashions, both arms, working with fresh oocytes, like organ transplantation, and we're working even with egg banking. And when we show with the fresh oocytes, we get the same clinical result with the same implantation rate, with the same number of embryos transferred, and we have no any statistical difference at all. The same happens when we use vitrification. It's slightly lower because we introduce vitrification, but we get completely the same clinical results. There are no statistical difference at all. Let me show you, this is also doing in donors. In our donors, we start using the embryoscope just to check how the embryos cleavage, how the embryos develop. And once we use, those are the different groups, using ACG or using agonist of GnRH, 103 cycles using ACG in 716 embryos versus 297 cycles using 2,000 embryos. We made the embryoscope, we see how they cleavage, and we saw that in the earliest phases of the early times of the cleavage, we saw a statistical difference once we triggering with GnRH agonist, were faster the embryos that we use GnRH agonist. And even this was no statistical difference, but it was the proportion of optimal embryos tends to be higher when we triggering with GnRH agonist. And even when we study with our criteria of the quality of the embryos in terms of the embryoscope, we see that was more proportion of embryos with has more chances to implant in terms of the embryoscope criteria. But I repeat you, that was no statistical difference. There are more benefits using GnRH agonist for triggering ovulation. We saw here this morning with Professor De Brooy that how we can avoid the ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And it's true, it's true. Here, with the paper of Maiden, is here in the room, show how we can avoid the ovarian hyperstimulation. And even in this meta-analysis where we published the work with Melo in 2009, in oocyte donation, is completely clear that we can benefit using GnRH agonist, just triggering the ovulation, just to avoid the ovarian hyperstimulation. This is our statistic when we use GnRH agonist versus HCG in 3,500 cycles, and we get 0% in hyperstimulation. None of our donors using GnRH agonist for triggering ovulation was under ovarian hyperstimulation. In the group that we use HCG, even was low because we always were afraid to have hyperstimulation. That's why we use middle ovarian stimulation also. But anyway, I will remark that was 0 in 3,500 patients. Why? Because it was a massive and irreversible luteolysis. That is what happened. That is the slide that I showed you when I saw the days of the luteal phase, and in the study of Pinard, that most of them got the period after 7, 8, 9, 10 days. You know that for hyperstimulation syndrome are some vascular mediators like a BEG. We know that for the studies of Raúl Gómez that the receptor 2 of BEG is increased. And if we block the receptor 2, we can prevent the ascites, and we decrease the ovarian vascularity permeability. And in this way, we study and we published this paper in Fertility Sterility in 2009, made by Dr. Ferrillo, where we studied two different groups, HCG, agonist of GnRH, and you see here how the luteal phase, when we use agonist of GnRH, was 5 days. After 5 days, usually they got the period. And was no one with symptoms and no one with moderate hyperstimulation. And once we study the quantity of BEG that we saw, we found in the follicular fluid much lower quantity of BEG in patients that we used GnRH agonist for triggering ovulation. And even once we went to analyze the RNA expression in both groups, we saw that it was much lower when we used GnRH agonist. At the same time, we check the quantity of follicular fluid, the abdominal fluid that was in the abdominal cavity. We study with the same explorer as we published some years before, and we saw that using GnRH agonist, the quantity of acidity was much lower using GnRH agonist. That is more or less the same. That is why we avoid the ovarian hyperstimulation. I'm telling the same things because one is with another one. Okay, just for finish my presentation, this is another work that we are doing with donors. But I'm going to do it briefly just because this is the topic of another conference, and I don't like to extend so much in this paper. But we evaluated the luteal receptivity doing ERA. ERA is the work that is doing Carlos Simon, just studying the gene expression of the endometrium. We have done in 15 donors, and all the donors were the same population. And this is the ovarian stimulation, the regular and standard ovarian stimulation, and the day of the triggering, we use it either HCG or agonist of GnRH. And then day plus 7, we made a biopsy just to analyze the gene expression of the endometrium. We used different protocols. I don't go through just because it's not the real topic of my speech. But I would like to say that in some we used estradiol plus progesterone. In another one, we used HCG as luteal phase support, just doing here in the LH day 0 or just using during the luteal phase. And we found that once we use either HCG or LAH, recombinant LAH, we found the gene expression closer to the control group. Instead, that when we use estradiol and progesterone. That is just briefly, because it's not my topic, but was a paper that we are doing now with donors. I repeat to you that all this data is doing in donors that are young and non-fertile, or even a different population than infertile patients. That means that this is the conclusion of this paper, that the E2 and P4 maybe is not the best complementary support for luteal phase when we use GnRH agonist for triggering. And for the last conclusion was in the same way that when I show you the objective when we are working with donors, because if the objectives were just to get the biggest and greatest and good embryos and avoid too hyperstimulation and side effects, using GnRH agonist, we can get both of them. We can get good results and we can avoid hyperstimulation. In terms of this, now we are stimulating all our donors who are triggering with GnRH agonist. Even in the patients, even it's not my talk, but even in the patients that we are not going to transfer the embryos, that we are going to vitrify or we are going to preserve fertilization, we are triggering with GnRH agonist. And even now, in the same way that Paul Debreu said before, most of the cases, we are now stimulating the ovarian stimulation. We are doing the pickup we fertilize the oocytes, we vitrify the embryos, and we don't transfer in that cycle, and we are waiting for a natural cycle to transfer later on, just to improve the implantation. In those cases, we are triggering with GnRH agonist. Thank you very much.